The morning after Robert's confession, Richard Williams sat in his penthouse study with the blinds half drawn against the pale Manhattan light. The city was awake beyond the glass horn's traffic and the endless grind of lives being lived, but silence pressed down like a second skin inside the room. Robert's betrayal should have been the end of it. At least that was what Richard wanted to believe. The butler had admitted to planting surveillance devices and taking payments from Peyton's people. 15 years of trust unraveled in minutes, neatly tied to a motive that made sense. It should have been enough, but it wasn't. Richard knew himself too well. He had built his empire on a sixth sense for when the numbers didn't add up, the smiles hid knives, and the room was lying to him. And now every instinct screamed that Robert was only one stone in a far heavier avalanche. He leaned back in the leather chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling's shadowed beams, his hand resting against his jaw. Beneath the surface calm, his mind churned with fragments that refused to lock together. Robert's access explained some things, documents, security breaches, but not all. Not the offshore accounts opened in his name. Not the forged contracts with signatures so perfect they could have been lifted from his pen. That level of precision required something deeper, someone closer. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. Alan Pierce entered without ceremony, his wiry frame taut with the energy of a man awake far too long. He carried a slim folder, its edges damp from the drizzle outside. Alan said, "You're not going to like this setting the folder on the desk." Richard gave a humorless smile. "I haven't liked much of anything lately." "Go on." Alan slid a photograph free, a blurred shot of a server room cables snaking across polished floors. Besides this, there is a printout of digital logs, lines of code, and access stamps in precise sequences. "These are from your Cain account breach," Alan said. "I traced the signal and followed it through the proxies. It didn't come from Peyton's network. It came from inside your own company." Richard's gaze sharpened. Which division? Alan hesitated. The Financial Oversight Unit. The very people responsible for flagging irregularities before they reached the board. For a moment, Richard said nothing. The silence thickened heavy as lead. Finally, he rose, moving to the window. From the 92nd floor, Manhattan stretched like a circuit board of light and motion. Every street a conduit, every building a sealed container of secrets. "Someone inside my walls," Richard murmured. Alan closed the folder. "Not just someone. Someone with clearance to override your private encryption. Someone who knows where you keep every skeleton." Richard's reflection stared back at him from the glass, tall, polished, but shadowed now by doubt. He had built Williams Enterprises on loyalty, forged through power and fear, but he knew both could crumble if the correct pressure were applied. "Do you have a name?" he asked finally. Alan shook his head. "Not yet, but I've narrowed it. 3 executives had the access required. One of them is bleeding information. I'll get proof." Richard's jaw tightened. Proof was the only language the world respected. Without it, suspicion was a noose that strangled indiscriminately. Alan's voice softened. "Richard, there's something else. If this is bigger than Peyton, you need to decide who you're letting in on this, including if it's someone inside your empire, Nancy." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Richard turned sharply. "She stays out of this." "Out." Alan raised a brow. "She's already in. They've targeted her before, followed her through the streets. She deserves to know how deep it goes. She deserves peace." Richard countered, his voice low but edged. "She deserves a life not measured by threats and surveillance files." Alan didn't argue, but his silence carried weight. After a moment, he said, "I'll keep digging. But Richard, don't wait too long to decide. Secrets have a way of choosing their own moment to come out. Richard remained at the window when the door shut, the city's reflection fractured by rain. Nancy's face rose in his mind, her steady gaze, the warmth she carried into rooms designed for cold. She had already become the fulcrum of his world, and that made her the perfect weapon for anyone who wanted to break him. Nancy noticed the shift that evening. She was in the library, a book in her lap, though she hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. The storm outside had faded to drizzle, and the room's lamplight wrapped her in soft amber. When Richard entered, she looked up, expecting his usual composure. But something was different. He carried his presence like a man walking through fog-controlled, yes, but shadowed as though he had left part of himself behind in the study. His tie was loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled, and though he tried for calm, she saw the weight in the set of his shoulders. "Long day?" she asked gently. He gave a short nod, crossing to the liquor cabinet. Alan found something. She set the book aside, and Richard poured whiskey into a glass but didn't drink. Instead, he stood with his back to her, staring at the dark liquid. "There's a traitor in the company. Someone inside my walls. They're not finished with me." The words should have been expected after all they'd endured, but the starkness of his tone tightened her chest. She rose, crossing the room until she stood close enough to feel the chill radiating off him. "And you weren't going to tell me?" she asked softly. He turned then, eyes sharp as flint. "Because telling you puts you deeper in it. Because every word I speak out loud is another thread they can pull." Nancy held his gaze unflinching. "Richard, I'm already in it. Don't you see I was followed, photographed, and threatened? My name's already in their game. Keeping me in the dark won't protect me. It will only blind me." He exhaled, the sound low, conflicted. He had spent years ruling empires with decisiveness, never questioning his instincts. But here with her, the lines blurred. Protecting her meant keeping her away. Loving her meant letting her close. And he didn't know which would destroy them faster. "You think I can't handle it?" she said quietly, reading the truth in his silence. His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to." Her hand rose, touching the side of his face, her thumb brushing the faint bruise that had not yet faded. "We don't get to choose the battles life throws at us, only whether we fight them together or apart." Richard closed his eyes briefly, the warmth of her touch cracking something he had tried to keep locked. When he opened them again, he searched her face, as though looking for proof she would survive the fire waiting for them both. "I can't promise you safety," he admitted, his voice rawer than he intended. "All I can promise is that if they come for you, they'll go through me first." Nancy's lips curved, not in amusement, but in quiet strength. "That's not the promise I need. I need you to promise you won't push me away when things get harder, that you'll let me stand beside you, not behind you." The words struck him deeper than any accusation could. He had spent his life keeping people at arm's length, wielding distance like armor. Yet here she was, asking not for protection, but for partnership. He set the untouched glass aside and pulled her into his arms. He held her against him for a long moment, his hand tangled in her hair, his breath uneven. Outside, the city pulsed, indifferent, but within the quiet walls, he surrendered himself to the truth he could no longer deny. Together, he whispered. Nancy closed her eyes, her heart steady against his chest. Together. Later that night, long after she had drifted into sleep, Richard returned to the study. He sat in the dim glow of the desk lamp, Alan's folder spread open before him. His eyes traced the digital trails, signatures, and forged documents designed to ruin him. But it wasn't the evidence that held him. It was the empty spaces between the facts. The gaps where motives hid, faces blurred, and trust dissolved into shadows. Robert's betrayal had been real, but Robert had only been the doorway. Now someone else was pulling strings somewhere in his empire, someone with patience access, and the precision of a surgeon cutting directly into his life. Richard pressed his hands against the desk, his reflection dark in the polished wood. The Ice King of Manhattan had never feared enemies, but this time was different. This time the battle wasn't just for his reputation or empire. It was for Nancy, and he would not lose. The city's skyline stretched in silver ribbons outside the penthouse, but Richard wasn't looking at it. He stood in the study with Alan, the blinds drawn low, the faint hum of the air system filling the silence between clipped sentences. Richard said, "She can't stay here." His voice hard, though the words themselves seemed to wound him as they left his mouth. Not when Cain is circling. Not when Peyton's reach keeps tightening. Alan leaned against the desk, arms folded. "If you're suggesting relocation, we'll need to plan it carefully. Discretion, alternate identities, maybe send her down south numb." Richard cut in sharply. He paced to the window, his reflection fractured by the glass. Somewhere quieter, out of New York, somewhere they won't think to look. I'll keep the city burning, keep the spotlight on me. She needs distance, Alan. That's the only way she'll survive this. The words were measured, decisive, but beneath them lay a tremor, a man already imagining a life stripped of the one presence that had begun to thaw him. Alan studied him for a long moment. "You realize what you're saying. You move her out, and she'll see it as exile, not protection." Richard's jaw clenched. "She'll see it however she wants. I can't risk her life because of me." The conversation should have stayed locked within those walls. But fate, or perhaps inevitability, had other plans. Nancy had not meant to overhear. She had come to bring them coffee, the tray balanced carefully in her hands, a simple act of presence on a weary evening. She paused in the hallway when she heard her name, her steps faltering. At first, she thought of retreating to spare them privacy. But then the words reached her. She can't stay here. Out of New York. Exile disguised as safety. The tray trembled in her grip. Porcelain rattled against silver. Her breath caught in her throat as the truth carved itself into her chest. The man who had whispered together now plotted to send her away. Quietly, she backed away from the study, leaving the coffee untouched on a side table. That night, the penthouse felt colder. Nancy sat in her quarters with the lamp dimmed low, her suitcase still in the corner where she had left it weeks ago. She traced the worn leather handle with her fingers, her thoughts spiraling. To him, was she still that woman with one suitcase and a fragile past, useful enough to soften his nights, to remind him he wasn't all ice, but not strong enough to stand when the fire closed in? She had endured Fist's abandonment, a life torn apart, and had been rebuilt from ashes. And yet here, in the very heart of Manhattan's glass and steel, she felt reduced again to a liability, not a partner. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not yet. The confrontation came the next morning. Richard entered the dining room crisp in a navy suit, expecting the usual rhythm. Nancy's quiet smile, the scent of coffee, the calm that grounded him before the day's chaos. Instead, he found her waiting, arms folded, her gaze steady, but charged with a storm he hadn't anticipated. "You were going to send me away," she said without preamble. He froze, mask slipping for the briefest moment before he straightened. "Nancy, don't." Her voice was low, firm. "I heard you every word." The silence that followed was sharp, brittle. Richard set his briefcase down slowly, like buying time to reorder the conversation into safer lines. "It was for your safety," he said finally. "This isn't a life you should be dragged into. You don't deserve to live under threats and shadows." Her laugh was short without humor. "And what do I deserve, Richard? To be locked away while you fight, to be kept at arm's length when every decision tears us both apart. You think this is about distance?" His voice rose sharper now. "It's about keeping you alive. And in doing that," she shot back, "you've already killed something else." Her words struck deeper than she knew. For the first time, Richard faltered. He had faced senators' billionaires' boardrooms stacked with enemies, but her gaze undid him. "You told me we were in this together," she continued, her voice breaking. "You said it wasn't about protection, but about trust. And now, I see I'm not a partner. I'm a liability you can't afford." Richard stepped forward, his hand half reaching for her, before dropping to his side. "That's not true, isn't it?" Her eyes glistened, but her voice held steady. "When you look at me, do you see the woman who stood by you when the city turned its back? Or do you know the weakness they'll use to destroy you?" The question carved silence into the room. Richard's lips parted, but no answer came because he did see both. Because loving her had become the sharpest, double-edged blade he'd ever held. Nancy's chest rose and fell, her hands clenched to keep from shaking. Finally, she whispered, "If you can't choose me without conditions, then maybe you don't choose me." She turned, walking past him, her footsteps echoing down the marble hall. Richard didn't stop her. He stood rooted in the dining room, surrounded by the untouched breakfast, the silence pressing in his reflection, fractured in the crystal glassware. For the first time since he'd met her, the Ice King felt something far colder than solitude. Nancy didn't leave the penthouse immediately. She couldn't. Where would she go? But that night, she didn't share the library with him or sit by the fire with poetry in her hands. She stayed in her quarters, the door closed, the city lights painting faint stripes across the floor. She lay awake, replaying his words, her own. The ache in her chest was not just fear of losing him. It was the fear of losing herself again, of becoming the silent woman who let someone else decide her fate. When she left Georgia, she had promised herself that she would never again be silenced and hidden away under the guise of protection. If Richard couldn't see her as an equal in this war, perhaps he wasn't the man she had begun to believe he was. Richard, meanwhile, sat in the study long past midnight, a glass of whiskey untouched at his elbow. Alan had sent new updates. Digital trails, narrowed suspects. But the words blurred on the page. His mind kept circling back to the look in Nancy's eyes, the echo of her voice. "If you can't choose me without conditions." He had lived a life of control, building walls so high that no one could breach them. And yet, in trying to protect her, he had built another wall, this time between them. For the first time in years, he wondered if his instincts, the very instincts that had made him untouchable in business, were the same instincts that would destroy the only love he had left. 2 days passed in strained silence. They spoke only when necessary, voices clipped, careful not to touch barely scabbed wounds. Magnolia noticed. The staff noticed. Even the penthouse seemed to notice the air colder, the rooms quieter, the warmth gone. On the third night, Richard found himself outside Nancy's door, his hand hovering above the handle. He wanted to go in, take back the words, and promise her the world. But his fingers curled into a fist, and he walked away instead. Inside, Nancy sat on the bed, her suitcase pulled closer this time, her hand resting on the leather, as though daring herself to reopen the chapters she had once vowed closed. Neither of them slept. By the end of the week, their rhythm had cracked entirely. Richard immersed himself in Alan's findings, chasing names and digital fingerprints like a man possessed. Nancy poured herself into work at the community center, staying late, walking home with her chin lifted, even when she felt eyes in the shadows. They passed each other in the halls, polite but distant, like strangers in the same house. And yet beneath the fractures, something fierce remained. Nancy still paused outside the study, some nights listening for the sound of him moving, reassured that he was alive. Richard still checked the security feeds, watching her return safely from Harlem before he could breathe again. But neither admitted it. Because sometimes the deepest wounds are not those inflicted by enemies, but by the people we love most. The fracture was there now, visible, undeniable, like a crack in glass that threatened to spread with every passing day. And though neither of them knew it yet, that crack would become the very fault line upon which their future together or apart would be decided. The first sign of Marcus Cain's return came on a Tuesday evening when the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan glowed like liquid gold under the lamplight. Richard had just finished another 12-hour gauntlet of meetings designed to hold his empire together with sheer force of will. He stepped into the penthouse foyer, the weight of silence pressing on him, as it always did now. Nancy was there, perched on the arm of a sofa, her coat still on, as though she hadn't decided whether to leave or stay. Their eyes met, briefly, fragile and aching, that distance between them. But before words could form, Magnolia appeared at the doorway. "Sir," she said, her voice taut. "Alan just called. There's been a development. You'll want to see this yourself." Moments later, Richard was in the study, Alan's voice crackling over the secure line. Cain made contact. The name alone froze the air. Marcus Cain, ghost predator shadow, in the city's veins. Richard's hand tightened on the edge of the desk, where he asked. He walked straight into the bar on 47th and asked for you. No threats. This time, no tailing Nancy. Just one message he wants to trade. Richard's eyes narrowed. Trade what information? He claims he knows who the real mastermind is, the one even Peyton answers to, but he wants freedom in return. The words landed like a knife tip against glass. Alan's voice was steady, but edged with caution. We can set a meeting. But if he slips away, Richard, we may never see him again. Richard leaned back, the leather chair groaning beneath him. It was a trap. It had to be. And yet, what if it wasn't? What if Cain truly carried the thread that could unravel everything? By then, Nancy had stepped into the study, quiet, as a shadow drawn by the tension that seemed to thrum through the walls. She stood in the corner listening. Her eyes found Richard's profile, the hard line of his jaw, the storm in his gaze. She saw the hesitation he rarely allowed anyone else to witness. "What will you do?" she asked softly. Richard turned. He hadn't realized she was there until her voice broke the air. For a moment, his expression shifted, caught between the urge to shield her and the impossibility of shutting her out. "I don't know." He admitted, the words rough scraped from the truth. The meeting was arranged 2 nights later in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the East River. The place smelled of rust and salt water lapping against the pilings outside. Richard arrived with Alan at his side, 2 other men shadowing them. Nancy had insisted on coming. He had refused initially, then relented when he realized she would follow anyway. Better to keep her where his eyes could find her than let her linger unguarded in the dark. The warehouse was a skeleton of iron beams and broken windows. Cain waited in the center, lean and unhurried, his hands visible at his sides. He looked almost ordinary in his black coat, but there was a sharpness in his stance, a predator's poise. Williams Cain greeted, his voice carrying just enough echo to feel dangerous. "You came." Richard stepped forward, his presence filling the space. "You said you had something worth hearing." Cain's gaze flicked toward Nancy, then back. "I said I had the truth. The question is, what's it worth to you?" Alan's voice cut in hard. "You're in no position to bargain." But Cain only smiled faintly. "Aren't I?" "You've been bleeding for months. Peyton's the name you feed the press, but you and I both know he's not clever enough to orchestrate the finer details. Offshore accounts forged handwriting, staged leaks. That's not his craft. He's a hammer. This job needed a scalpel. Richard's expression didn't shift, but the words lodged deep inside. He had suspected as much. Peyton was powerful, yes, but unsubtle. Someone else had the precision to dismantle him piece by piece. "You know who it is," Richard said. Cain nodded once. "I do. And I'll tell you in exchange for freedom. You let me walk out tonight clean. No tails, no traps." Alan bristled. "You expect us just to let you disappear?" "Yes." Cain's tone was calm, almost serene. "Because without me, you'll spend months chasing shadows. With me, you have a name before sunrise. The choice is yours." The silence stretched thick as smoke. Richard's pulse hammered. This would have been the opening he needed if Cain had told the truth. But if it were a lie, granting him freedom would be like releasing a wolf back into the wild one that already knew the scent of Nancy's skin, the layout of Richard's fortress. Nancy stepped closer, her presence grounding and perilous all at once. "Richard," she whispered, "listen to him. He has no reason to invent this. If he wanted us ruined, he's already done more than enough." Her voice pierced the fog of calculation. Richard looked at her, searching her face, finding the quiet certainty in her eyes. She wasn't naive. She knew Cain was dangerous, but she also knew when truth carried weight. For a moment, Richard felt the fracture between them throb again. She was still beside him even when their trust had cracked. And now she was asking him to risk everything on faith. He turned back to Cain. "You get one chance. Speak." Cain's smile curved thin and sharp. He stepped forward into the faint pool of lamplight, his eyes glinting like glass in shadow. "The mastermind," he said slowly, "is already inside your empire. Not Peyton, not his cronies. Someone you've broken bread with. Someone you've trusted to keep your world intact." Richard's stomach tightened, the words chilling, because they echoed his unspoken fear. "Name," he demanded. Cain shook his head. "Not until I walk out that door untouched. You give me that, and the name is yours." Alan swore under his breath, his hand brushing the gun at his hip. "He's playing you." But Richard didn't move. He studied Cain, the controlled rhythm of his breathing, the calm steadiness of his gaze. This wasn't the face of a man bluffing. This was a man who had already won something just by being heard. Nancy spoke then, her voice low, but carrying in the cavernous space. "If you hold back now, Richard, you'll always wonder. If you let him go, you'll have the truth to fight with." Her words settled over him like the final weight tipping a scale. Richard exhaled slowly. "Fine. You walk out free. But if you lie to me, Cain, there won't be a corner of this city you can vanish to." Cain inclined his head like they had just sealed a business contract. "Fair enough." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a razor whisper. "The one who's been cutting you apart from the inside is Thomas Graham." The name detonated in Richard's chest like a blast. Thomas, his lawyer, his confidant, the man who had walked him through courtroom battles, who had known every secret ledger, every private account, the man Richard had trusted with his future. "No," Richard muttered, shaking his head. "You're lying." Cain straightened. "Believe what you want. But when the dust settles, you'll see the truth. Thomas has been selling you piece by piece. Peyton is just the front." He stepped back into the shadows, his coat brushing the damp concrete. "Now, our bargain." Richard's men shifted, tension coiled in their stance. Alan's voice was sharp. "Richard." But Richard raised a hand. He was many things, but he wasn't a man who broke his word. "Let him go." Cain's smile widened faintly. Then he melted into the darkness, his footsteps fading against the echoing beams. Within moments, the warehouse swallowed him whole. The silence afterward was crushing. Alan cursed under his breath, slamming a fist against the desk they had set up. "You just let a devil walk free." Richard didn't answer. His gaze was locked on the space where Cain had stood, his mind repeating the name repeatedly like a curse. Nancy's hand found his arm, tentative but steady. "You don't believe him?" Richard looked at her, his eyes storm dark. "I don't know what I believe anymore." And in that admission, Nancy felt the ground tilt beneath her. Because if Thomas Graham, trusted, loyal, almost family, could be the traitor, then nothing in Richard's world was as solid as it seemed. For the first time, she understood that the battle wasn't just business or politics. It was personal in ways that would cut deeper than she had ever imagined. And she realized with a cold certainty that she was no longer standing at the edge of Richard's war. She was inside it. The city never truly slept, but Manhattan felt unnervingly quiet that night. The lights below blinked like distant constellations from the penthouse windows, detached from the storm, gathering inside Richard Williams's world. Marcus Cain's words echoed in him long after the warehouse emptied. "Thomas Graham, your confidant, your betrayer." Richard had replayed it on the drive back, each repetition, carving a deeper groove into his thoughts. Thomas wasn't just a lawyer. He had been the architect behind Richard's legal strategies, the guardian of secrets, too valuable to commit to paper. Thomas had stood beside him for 16 years, through boardroom wars and courtroom ambushes. Loyalty like that wasn't transactional. It had been blood and bone. Or so Richard believed. Alan had wasted no time. By dawn, he had compiled a thick dossier of financial records, encrypted messages, and even time-stamped server logs that traced back to Thomas's private network. The evidence lay across the desk in the study, neat stacks that smelled faintly of toner and betrayal. Nancy hovered at the doorway, drawn by the gravity of the moment. She watched Richard sift through the papers, his expression unreadable, though she could see the storm raging beneath the surface. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "If this is true, then Cain was right. The knife in my back didn't come from Peyton's hand. It came from Thomas's." Nancy stepped closer. "But is it true?" Richard's gaze flicked up sharp. "The evidence is damning." "Evidence can be arranged," she said gently, though the words cut. "You know how easily shadows can be twisted into shapes that look like the truth." He studied her, searching her face. "You think I'm blind to that?" "No." She reached out, laying a hand on the edge of the desk close to his. "You're a man who has been taught to expect betrayal at every corner. And right now, you're willing to believe the worst, because it hurts less than hoping you're wrong." The silence between them thickened heavy, with things unspoken. Richard turned back to the papers, his jaw set. Thomas had access. The Cayman breach and forged signatures all passed through his channels. Who else could it be? Nancy picked up one of the sheets. The digital log showed a series of login times, matching Thomas's credentials. But something snagged her attention, a small detail most would overlook. "These entries," she murmured, tracing the lines with her finger. "They're too neat, perfectly spaced, precise to the second." Richard frowned. And that's not how people work. Not even meticulous men like Thomas. No one logs into a system at the same minute every day for 2 weeks straight. Not unless they're trying to paint a picture. Her eyes lifted, meeting his. "A picture someone wanted you to see." For the first time that night, uncertainty cracked his mask. The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. Thomas Graham arrived at the penthouse the following morning, unannounced, but not unusual. He had always treated the Williams Tower as an extension of his domain. He carried his leather briefcase, his silver hair immaculate, his expression calm as ever. Richard greeted him smoothly. You asked for me. Richard stood by the window, arms folded the skyline at his back like a steel wall. Nancy remained seated in the corner, silent but watchful. I did. Richard said, his voice controlled, precise. We need to talk. Thomas arched a brow. About what? Richard gestured to the folder on the desk. About this. Thomas crossed the room, opened the folder, and scanned the contents. His expression didn't flicker, though Nancy caught the faintest tightening at the corner of his mouth. Interesting, Thomas said finally. Logs, transfers, digital footprints. And all pointing at me. You deny it? Richard asked. Thomas closed the folder with deliberate calm. Of course I deny it. If I had wanted to destroy you, Richard, I wouldn't have waited 16 years. Richard's jaw tightened. Cain named you. Cain. Thomas's composure slipped for the first time, his voice edged with disdain. You're trusting the word of a mercenary who has spent his life selling lies for a price. Richard didn't answer. The silence itself was accusation enough. Thomas's gaze darkened. After everything we've built, everything I've shielded you from, you look at a few forged documents, and you doubt me. Nancy spoke then. Her voice was calm but firm, because the evidence was too perfect. Thomas. Too clean. Whoever set this up knew Richard would see it as undeniable. Thomas turned to her, his eyes narrowing. And you believe I'm the puppet instead of the puppeteer? I believe someone wanted your name on those papers, Nancy replied steadily. And they succeeded, maybe because you were careless or too close. The tension crackled like static. Richard looked from one to the other, his chest tight. He wanted to believe Thomas and hold on to 16 years of trust. But Cain's words, digital trails and photographs pressed down like a verdict. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice sharp as glass. Until I know the truth, I can't trust you. You'll step back from the company effective immediately. Thomas stiffened. You can't be serious. I am, Richard said coldly. Your access is revoked. Your files are under review. If you're innocent, it will clear. If not, you'll cut me out. Thomas finished, his tone bitter. Richard's silence was answer enough. Thomas gathered his briefcase, his movements precise, controlled. But when he turned to leave, his eyes lingered on Nancy, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. You've changed him, he said quietly, and not entirely for the better. Then he was gone. The door closed, and the penthouse seemed to exhale. Richard stood rigid, his hand braced against the desk. Nancy rose, crossing to him, but stopped just short. You don't believe him, she said softly. Richard's eyes burned with conflict. I don't know what to believe. Cain gave me a name. Alan gave me proof. And yet, he shook his head. And yet your words echo louder than theirs. Nancy's throat tightened. Then listen to that echo. For a moment, he looked at her as if she were the only solid thing left in a world built on shifting sand. But beneath it, doubt still gnawed. Because in the window's glass, his reflection stared back, tall, immaculate, lifeless. And beside it, faintly mirrored, was Nancy. She had become the constant in a life defined by betrayal. Yet she could not change the truth. Someone was still pulling strings in his empire. And if it wasn't Thomas Graham, the real traitor was still hiding, watching, waiting. That night, as Manhattan pulsed below, Richard stood at the window long after Nancy had gone to her room. He traced his reflection with his eyes, the man in the mirror looking back at him with cold detachment. He thought of Thomas's face, Cain's whisper, and Nancy's steady gaze, insisting the picture was staged. For the first time in years, Richard realized he was not looking at the enemy across the table. He was looking for the enemy in the glass. and he didn't know whose face he would see next. The Williams Tower rose against the sky that Friday morning, glass and steel, catching the light as if untouchable. For years, the building had stood as a monument to Richard's empire, precision, discipline, invulnerability. But beneath the gleaming facade, shadows had begun to gather, patient and deliberate. Nancy had arrived early that day. The tower's lower floors were open to public-facing divisions, philanthropy offices, community outreach, and a training center that Richard funded quietly, the side of his empire most rarely seen. She had volunteered to meet with a youth program director, which gave her purpose beyond the tight orbit of the penthouse. Richard, meanwhile, was upstairs on the executive floor, locked in a meeting with Alan and several board members. His mind was already a storm: Thomas's suspension, Cain's accusation, the fracture of trust spreading through his inner circle. He didn't yet know that sparks had already been planted in the belly of the building. At 10:42 a.m., the fire alarms shrieked. The sound sliced through glass and marble, jarring, merciless. Lights strobed red in the corridors, and the calm rhythm of the office shattered into panic. Richard rose instantly, his instincts faster than thought. "Report," he snapped, turning to Alan. Alan's phone was already in his hand, his voice taut as he listened to security. "Lower floors. Origin unclear. Evacuation in progress." Richard's pulse spiked. "Which floors?" "Levels 3 through 6. Nancy was on level 4. For a moment the world narrowed to a tunnel of sound, the distant wail of alarms, the rushing of blood in his ears. He didn't think. He only moved. Richard, Allen called after him. "The fire teams." But Richard was already in the corridor, his stride a force of will. The elevator was locked down, so he descended the stairs with the relentless precision of a man who refused to calculate odds. The smoke was thick when he reached the 4th floor, acrid and choking. Flames licked at the far end of the hallway, devouring plaster glass, cracking under the heat. "Nancy." His voice thundered through the chaos. For a moment, only silence answered. Then a cough ragged desperate. He pushed through the smoke, ignoring the burn in his lungs. Through the haze, he saw her pressed against a stairwell door that refused to budge, her eyes wide, but steady, even as the firelight painted her in orange and shadow. Richard. He was at her side in seconds, his hand closing over hers on the handle. It was locked, jammed by heat or sabotage. He couldn't know which. But he knew one thing: she wasn't staying here. "Step back," he commanded. Nancy obeyed, though her body shook with adrenaline. Richard braced, then drove his shoulder against the door with brutal force. Once. Twice. On the third strike, the lock gave with a metallic scream, the door flying open to reveal a stairwell, hazy with smoke, but blessedly clear of flame. He grabbed her hand, pulling her close. "Stay with me." They descended together, and every step was a battle against smoke and panic. The stairwell filled with chaos, shouts from other floors, the pounding of feet, the distant roar of fire. A ceiling tile crashed down at one landing, scattering dust and sparks. Richard shielded Nancy with his body, pushing her forward before himself. On the 2nd floor, the stairwell opened into a lobby where fire crews had begun flooding. The sudden rush of fresh air hit them like salvation, carrying with it the shouts of first responders. But just as relief threatened to break through, Richard caught sight of the flames curling higher behind them, climbing faster than they should have. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. This wasn't an accident. Outside, the tower loomed with smoke billowing from its lower levels, the air alive with sirens and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Crowds had gathered, their voices a mix of fear and fascination, as they filmed with phones the modern instinct to capture disaster. Richard led Nancy through the chaos, one arm locked protectively around her. Her cheeks were streaked with soot, her eyes watering from smoke, but she was alive. When they reached the barricade, the crowd pressed closer, whispers rising. Williams. That's Richard Williams. And the woman with him. Richard ignored them. For once, the eyes of the world meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the woman in his arms, her pulse still hammering under his touch. Nancy sagged against him, coughing, but when she looked up, her gaze was steady. "You shouldn't have come for me," she rasped. His eyes burned raw with smoke, and something more profound. "I will always come for you." And then, in the chaos of sirens and shouted orders, he pulled her into his arms and held her in the swirl of smoke and flashing lights. Not the controlled embrace of a man keeping appearances, but the fierce, unguarded grip of someone who had nearly lost everything. She clung to him, her fingers knotting into his suit, her body trembling not from fear, but from the release of it. For a long moment, the world fell away, leaving only the two of them standing in the wreckage. When the fire was finally contained, investigators swarmed. The official narrative came quickly: an electrical fault, a wiring malfunction. But Richard knew better. He had seen the flames climb too cleanly, too deliberately. Alan joined him later, his face grim. The fire marshal's already under pressure to call it an accident. But off the record, traces of accelerant in the wiring ducts. This was staged. Richard's jaw tightened. A message. Alan nodded. They wanted to show you that nowhere is safe. Not your tower. Not your people. Richard's gaze shifted across the barricades to where Nancy sat wrapped in a blanket, her hair disheveled, her skin smudged, but her posture steady. She spoke softly to a shaken young employee who had fled the lower floors, her hand resting reassuringly on the woman's shoulder. Even here, surrounded by chaos, Nancy remained calm. Strength. Light. Richard's chest tightened. Whoever had orchestrated this wanted to strip him bare, to tear apart his empire piece by piece. But in that moment, watching Nancy, he understood with piercing clarity they would never win. Not if he refused to let them take her from him. Later that night, back in the penthouse, the city stretched silent and indifferent beyond the glass. Nancy sat curled on the sofa, still wrapped in the blanket, her hair damp from the shower she had taken to wash away smoke and ash. Richard stood at the window, his reflection sharp against the lights. For a long time he said nothing. Then slowly he turned. "I need you to hear this," he said, his voice low but steady. Nancy lifted her eyes, weary but attentive. "I can rebuild towers," he continued. "I can fight Peyton, the FBI, whoever else comes for me. I've done it before. But today, when I thought I'd lost you in that fire..." His voice faltered, the words rawer than he intended. "I realized I can't rebuild you. I can't replace you. If they take you from me, there is no empire worth saving." Tears glimmered in her eyes, not of fear, but of recognition. He crossed the room, sank to his knees before her, and took her hands. His suit still smelled faintly of smoke, his hair disordered, his composure stripped bare. "I've been a fool," he whispered, "pushing you away, deciding for you, pretending distance was protection. But today, when the fire closed in, I understood I'd rather burn with you than live in a world without you. That is my truth." Nancy's breath caught her heart aching at the rawness of him. She touched his face, her thumb, brushing the soot faintly clinging to his jaw. "Then, let's make each other a promise," she said softly. "No more walls, no more secrets. Whatever comes, we face it together." Richard closed his eyes briefly, then pressed his forehead to hers. Together he swore. And something unbreakable was born in that quiet vow, forged not in boardrooms or contracts, but in smoke and fire. Outside, the tower still smoldered, a scar against the skyline. But inside the penthouse, in the arms of the woman who had walked through flames with him, Richard felt something he had not known in 16 years. Not just survival, hope. The city was still carrying the scent of smoke. A week had passed since the fire, but the shadow of it lingered on the news in whispered boardroom conversations, in the way Richard's security doubled their vigilance. For Nancy, it lived in her lungs, faint but insistent, a reminder of how close the flames had come. One afternoon, she found herself at a small cafe between a florist and a bookstore in the Upper East Side. It was the kind of place she chose for its quiet anonymity, a brief escape from the marble and glass of Williams Tower. She had barely lifted the porcelain cup to her lips when the door opened and a presence swept in like a gust of winter air. Margaret Williams. Richard's mother had always carried herself like royalty, not ostentatious, but with a precision that bent rooms around her. Her pearl gray coat was buttoned to the throat, her gloves immaculate, her silver hair gathered in a knot as sharp as her gaze. Nancy's spine stiffened. Their last encounter had been laced with barbs. Margaret's disapproval wrapped in silk, but no less cutting. She had braced herself for it again. But Margaret didn't attack. Instead, she crossed the cafe with measured steps and inclined her head as though this meeting had been written long before either arrived. "Miss Martin," she said, her voice low but carrying. "May I?" Nancy gestured to the chair opposite, careful to keep her expression steady. "Of course." Margaret sat smoothing her gloves into her lap. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the murmur of the cafe. Then, unexpectedly, Margaret spoke with something almost resembling candor. "I owe you an apology." Nancy blinked. "I wasn't expecting that." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "Nor was I until recently. But the fire?" Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the city hummed in winter's pale light. "It reminded me that arrogance can blind us, even when we think we protect what we love." Nancy studied her, wary but listening. Arrogance or fear? Margaret's lips curved, faint and bitter. Both. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharper now. "You should understand, Miss Martin. My life has been devoted to ensuring my family's survival. That requires more than affection. It requires strategy. I judged you harshly because I feared you were a weakness Richard could not afford." Nancy's pulse tightened, but she met the older woman's gaze. "And now I see you are not weak." Margaret's voice lowered. "You may be the one thing standing between him and destruction." The words unsettled Nancy, not because they frightened her, but because they felt like the closest thing to a blessing Margaret Williams could give. The conversation shifted. Margaret removed one glove, folding it neatly beside her cup. "You've heard of Senator Peyton, of course. His reputation is formidable." Nancy nodded. "Richard believes he's behind much of what's happening." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Not entirely. The senator is dangerous, yes, but he is also predictable. His power comes from politics, from networks of favors and debts. The subtler cruelty, the precision with which your Richard has been targeted, comes not from him." Nancy's breath caught. Then from whom Margaret's expression hardened like ice catching the light. His daughter, Evelyn. The name hit like a stone. Nancy had heard it before, whispered in Richard's world, a socialite. A match once proposed a figure of polished ambition. But Margaret's voice sharpened the edges. Years ago, Margaret continued, Evelyn was not just an acquaintance. She was Richard's shadow. She believed she would become his wife, the next queen, in a dynasty built of glass and steel. And when Richard ended it, when he refused her, she did not forgive. Nancy listened, her heart tightening as puzzle pieces shifted. Margaret said that her father wanted the alliance for power, but Evelyn liked it for something darker. To control him, to wear his name not as a crown, but as a chain. And when she lost, she vowed to ruin him. She is not her father's puppet. She is his puppeteer. He lends her his influence, his network, his money. But the orchestration, the cold dismantling of Richard's life, that is Evelyn's hand. Nancy's throat felt dry. Why tell me this? Margaret's gaze softened just a fraction. Because you need to understand the enemy you face. Peyton's power is vast, but Evelyn's obsession with war is vast. She will not stop until Richard kneels, or until he is destroyed. The weight of it pressed into Nancy's chest. She thought of the fire, the forged documents, the photographs slipped under doors. Not just strategies, but vendettas. Not just politics, but passion twisted into cruelty. She drew in a slow breath. And what do you want me to do with this? Margaret's eyes held hers, unyielding, but not cruel. Stand with him, not as his shield, not as his liability, but as his equal. You see, Miss Martin, I was wrong about you. You are not here to weaken him. You are here to remind him that some wars are not won in boardrooms or headlines, but in hearts that refuse to break. For the first time, Nancy saw through the frost. Margaret Williams was not a mother untouched by love. She was a woman who had armored herself so completely that love had become strategy protection turned to ice. And now that armor was cracking. The cafe had emptied by the time Margaret rose. She slid her gloves back on her movements, elegant, deliberate. Do not mistake me for a friend. She said, her tone cool again. But know this, I am not your enemy. My methods may differ, but our goal is the same, Richard's survival. Nancy stood as well. Then for once, we can want the same thing. A flicker of something unreadable crossed Margaret's face. Not approval, not quite affection, but recognition. She inclined her head. Protect him. From Evelyn. From himself. And with that she swept out of the cafe, leaving Nancy in the hush of her absence. That night, Nancy sat alone in the penthouse library, the city's glow spilling across the shelves. She replayed Margaret's words, the truth folded inside them like a blade. Evelyn Peyton. The name tasted of danger now, of obsession and fire. And Nancy knew Margaret was right. Evelyn wasn't just fighting for power. She was fighting for possession. Richard entered quietly, loosening his tie, the day's fatigue heavy on him. When he saw her, his expression softened, the lines of command slipping. You've been quiet, he said gently. Nancy looked up, her heart tight with everything she carried. I saw your mother today. His brows rose, startled. My mother. She found me, Nancy said. And she told me something you need to hear. She recounted the meeting, each word deliberate. Richard listened, his face unreadable, though she saw the flicker in his eyes when Evelyn's name was spoken. When she finished, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken history. Finally, Richard exhaled, his hand dragging through his hair. I should have known, he murmured. Evelyn never accepted no. To her, rejection was war. He looked at Nancy, then his gaze raw. And now she's using everything, her father, her networks, to finish what she started. Nancy rose, stepping close. She laid her hand against his chest, feeling the thrum of his heart. Then we don't fight shadows anymore. We fight her, together. Richard covered her hand with his grip steady, grounding. The weight pressing down shifted for the first time in weeks. Together, he echoed. And though the city outside moved on, indifferent inside the penthouse, a fragile alliance had been forged, not just between Richard and Nancy, but with the woman Nancy had once thought her most significant obstacle. Margaret Williams might still be the Ice Queen, but even ice under the right light could reveal truth. The winter night was too quiet for a city like New York. From the penthouse windows, the skyline glittered as though nothing had shifted. But Richard knew better. The storm was no longer approaching. It was already inside his walls. For days, Alan had been working with a small team, tracing every wire, every ledger, every digital footprint left behind after the fire. What they found was damning. A trail ending in the one name Richard had prayed would never reappear was buried beneath layers of shell companies and encrypted accounts. Thomas Graham, his friend, his confidant, his shield in courtrooms, and the architect of his legal fortress. Now his betrayer. Alan laid the folder on Richard's desk, his voice grim. We have him. Not just suspicions this time. Direct links payments funneled through Evelyn Payton's private trust signatures match. Thomas's hand-on agreements designed to strip you of voting control. Richard's hand hovered over the folder, but didn't open it. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy. Say it plainly, he ordered. Alan hesitated. Thomas then worked with Evelyn. Together, they've been orchestrating the collapse of your empire. With her father's reach and his knowledge of your foundations, they had everything they needed to tear you down piece by piece. The words should have shattered him. Instead, they left him cold, almost numb. A man like Richard Williams didn't collapse when the knife entered his back. He froze, then sharpened. Nancy was at his side, her hand brushing his arm. She said nothing, but the steadiness of her presence anchored him against the tide threatening to pull him under. Finally, Richard opened the folder. The evidence was meticulous. Richard had never approved emails, wire transfers, or draft merger contracts. Even recorded conversations. Thomas's voice low, deliberate colluding with Evelyn about timing and strategy. It was irrefutable. And yet as Nancy leaned closer, scanning the documents, her brow furrowed. Richard, look at this. She pointed to one of the financial ledgers. These entries are dated to the days Thomas was with you, publicly. There are news articles and photographs of you both at events. He couldn't have been making these transactions at the same time. Richard frowned, leaning closer. The realization struck hard. The evidence had been constructed, but not flawlessly. Staged, Nancy whispered. Just like the logs before. It's meant to look undeniable, but some details don't add up. Whoever created this wanted it to be obvious. Alan straightened. Obvious enough that if we take it to the board, they'll believe it. And if Thomas denies it, he can claim you fabricated it to frame him. Richard's jaw clenched. The trap was exquisite. If he stayed silent, Thomas would continue to bleed him. If he moved, the narrative could be twisted into an act of desperation, the Ice King falsifying evidence to save himself. Nancy touched his hand lightly, her voice low. They're not just trying to ruin you. They're trying to paint you as the villain in your own story. The confrontation with Thomas came the next day. Richard had him summoned to a private conference room on the 47th floor. The walls were glass, the skyline stretching like a stage beyond. But the air was suffocating inside. Thomas entered with his usual calm, his briefcase in hand, his expression as composed as ever. But there was something different now, an edge of calculation in his eyes, as though he already knew the role he would play. Richard greeted him smoothly, setting the briefcase on the table. I heard you wanted to speak. Richard didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, his presence a blade. I know what you've done. Thomas arched a brow, almost amused. You'll need to be more specific. Richard slid the folder across the table. The accounts, the contracts, your partnership with Evelyn Payton. Thomas opened the folder, scanned a page or two, and then closed it deliberately. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Impressive, he said softly, but you and I both know this evidence didn't come from me. Richard's fists tightened at his sides. Please don't insult me. I'm not. Thomas's tone sharpened. I'm telling you the truth. This, he tapped the folder, isn't mine. It's yours. Richard's breath stilled. What are you saying? Thomas leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from him like a man who had rehearsed this moment. The board will see this as fabricated. The media will salivate over the narrative of Richard Williams, forging evidence to frame his most loyal advisor. And when they do, every deal you've touched in the past decade will be questioned. Every contract, every acquisition. You won't just lose the company, you'll lose credibility. Permanently. Nancy's heart pounded, but she stepped forward, her voice steady. Why, Thomas? After everything. Why betray him? Thomas's mask cracked for the first time, not with guilt, but with something darker. Because Richard doesn't deserve to hold it all, he said coldly. He built an empire on ice, keeping everyone at a distance, even the ones who stood by him. I gave him loyalty for years. And what did I get? A place in his shadow, always second, always expendable. Evelyn offered me what he never would, power, a chance to step out of the shadows and claim what I was owed. Richard's jaw tightened, but his voice was ice. You were never in my shadow, Thomas. You chose to stand there. Thomas's laugh was short and bitter. Believe what you like. But the board won't care. They'll see this evidence, they'll hear my denial, and they'll watch your empire collapse under the weight of your supposed lies. He stood gathering his briefcase. And when the smoke clears, Evelyn and I will be standing. The door closed behind him, and the room seemed to contract. Nancy turned to Richard, her eyes burning. He's playing you. He's counting on you to lose control, to hand him the narrative. Richard exhaled long and slow, his shoulders taut with restraint. He knows the board. He knows the courts. And he knows me. Nancy stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. Then we showed him he didn't know everything. We find the flaws in his story, the cracks in his mask. He built this trap too perfectly. It means he left fingerprints somewhere. We'll find them. Richard looked at her, the storm in his gaze meeting the steady fire in hers. In that moment, he realized that Thomas and Evelyn had miscalculated. They had underestimated the one weapon he had, that no betrayal could erase Nancy's clarity. He nodded slowly. Then we hunt for what he missed. That night, as Manhattan glittered indifferent beyond the windows, Richard stood with Nancy in the library. The folder lay between them, its pages a battlefield of truth and lies. For years, Richard had fought with strategy, precision, and distance. But this war was different. It wasn't just about markets and power, but trust, betrayal, love, and survival. Nancy touched his hand, her voice soft but steady. You're not alone in this fight. Not anymore. Richard's chest tightened, the words carving through the ice that had kept him breathing for 16 years. He covered her hand with his, grounding himself in her presence. Thomas's mask had slipped. Evelyn's obsession was laid bare. And the fire that had nearly consumed them both had forged something more substantial than fear. Together they would turn the tide. Because even the sharpest betrayal could not sever a bond forged in flames. The city moved on as if nothing had changed. The fire was yesterday's headline. Thomas's suspension, a whisper on trading floors. Peyton's name buried in speculation columns. But for Richard and Nancy, the world had tilted on its axis. It began quietly, so quietly, Nancy almost dismissed it. A weariness she couldn't explain, mornings where the taste of coffee turned her stomach, nights when her body begged for rest, long before the skyline dimmed. At first she blamed the smoke from the fire, the endless tension pressing into her days. But when the signs persisted, a quiet certainty took root in her chest. One afternoon, while Richard was locked in another strategy session with Alan, Nancy slipped out. She told no one where she was going, her steps deliberate but trembling beneath the weight of possibility. The clinic was discreet, a brick building in Brooklyn, where faces blurred into anonymity. She waited in a pale green room, her fingers twisting around themselves, as the doctor's words confirmed what her heart already suspected. You're pregnant, Miss Martin. About 6 weeks along. The world stilled. Pregnant. Nancy pressed a hand against her abdomen, her mind rushing and silent. Fragile, unplanned, but fiercely honest a life was beginning inside her. For a moment, joy welled up sharp and luminous. But fear followed quickly. What would this mean for Richard and for them both? Could a child become another battlefield in a war where perception was weaponized? That night, she told him. Richard was in the library. His tie loosened his posture, heavy with the weight of Thomas's betrayal. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening as it always did when she crossed the threshold. "Nancy," he murmured, "you look pale. Are you?" She stopped him with a raised hand, her breath unsteady. "Richard, there's something you need to know." He set his glass aside, every muscle in him tightening. "What is it?" She crossed the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. The words hung in the air, suspended between them. Then he rose slowly, afraid to break the fragile truth. "Pregnant." She nodded, her hand instinctively resting against her abdomen. 6 weeks. Richard's world collapsed and rebuilt itself in a single heartbeat. For 16 years, he had carried the verdict of sterile clinics, the cold words of doctors who told him he would never father children. He had buried that dream in the wreckage of Hannah's death, locking it away as firmly as his grief. And now, this. He closed the space between them in 2 steps, his hands trembling as they cupped her face. "Nancy, are you certain?" Tears shimmered in her eyes. "Yes." His forehead pressed to hers, his breath ragged. The Ice King cracked completely for the first time, not with fury or despair, but with awe. After everything, he whispered, voice breaking. "After, I thought it was lost forever. This is fate. This is a miracle." Nancy's hands covered his, grounding him. "It's hope," she said softly. "But Richard, it's also dangerous. If Evelyn or Thomas finds out." "They won't." He cut in fiercely, his protective instinct igniting. "No one will use this against you, against us. I won't let them." But even as he said it, they both knew the truth. Secrets never stayed buried in Richard's world. The first strike came 2 days later. Headlines exploded across business channels and gossip columns alike. Photographs of Nancy leaving the clinic, though taken from an angle that distorted context, plastered the internet. The stories were vicious, orchestrated with surgical cruelty. Billionaire's mystery girlfriend. Pregnant, is it a power play? From housekeeper to heiress. Nancy Martin's calculated rise. William's legacy. Threatened Ice King's future in the hands of a gold digger. The cruelty wasn't just in the words, but in the precision of their release. Evelyn Peyton's fingerprints were all over it. The timing, the spin, the ability to turn truth into poison. Nancy sat in the penthouse living room, the television muted, but the scrolling headlines unavoidable. Her hands trembled around the remote as bile rose in her throat. Richard entered to find her there, her shoulders rigid, her eyes glistening with fury and hurt. "They know," she said hoarsely. "They twisted it into something ugly before we could even celebrate." He crossed to her, taking the remote from her grip and tossing it aside. "Look at me, Nancy." She lifted her gaze, and in his eyes she saw fire. It was not cold fury, not icy control, but something hotter and sharper. "This is not their story," he said, each word deliberate. "This is ours, and I swear to you, no matter what they write or whisper, I will not let them take this from us." Her breath shuddered. "But they'll come after the baby. They'll make me look like..." They'll make you look like what they fear. He interrupted, his voice low, protective. A woman strong enough to change me, to change everything. The following days were a blur of strategy and siege. Alan scrambled to contain the narrative, but the Peyton network was relentless, feeding tabloids and financial outlets alike. Board members whispered about instability, investors fretted over scandal. And through it all, Nancy endured the sting of public judgment. Photographers lingered outside the building, their lenses hungry. Strangers online dissected her history, her motives, her worth. But inside the penthouse, Richard was unyielding. He insisted on being at her side, his hand steady against hers, his gaze a shield. At night, when she faltered, he whispered promises she had never thought she would hear from him. "They can take my company," he murmured against her hair. "They can take my reputation, but they will never take you, or our child." For Nancy, the words were both comfort and ache. She knew how much he had sacrificed already, how much he stood to lose. And yet, for the first time, she realized that Richard Williams, the man the world called the Ice King, was willing to burn his empire to protect the family he had thought he'd never have. But Evelyn was not finished. At a charity gala the following week, she made her move. Draped in emerald silk, her smile sharp as glass, she positioned herself before cameras with calculated grace. When asked about the scandal swirling around Richard, she tilted her head, her voice dripping with feigned sympathy. "I only hope he finds happiness." But one must wonder, when a woman appears out of nowhere with no background of influence or stature, carrying a child so conveniently. Is it love or ambition? Richard has always been vulnerable to those who know how to play his heart. The clip spread like wildfire. By dawn, every network replayed her words, her insinuation cutting deeper than any headline. Richard watched the footage silently, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. Nancy stood behind him, the sting of Evelyn's venom slicing through her. Finally, Richard turned, his eyes dark with resolve. "She's made this war personal. And now so will I." Nancy touched his arm, her voice low. "Richard, don't let her twist you into her game." He looked at her, his expression raw. "This isn't about games anymore. It's about protecting you and protecting our child. And I will not let Evelyn Peyton write the ending to our story." That night, as the city pulsed, indifferent beyond the windows, Nancy lay awake beside him, her hand resting gently on her abdomen. Fear and hope warred within her, but beneath it all was certainty. This child was not just life. It was defiance. It proved that love could bloom even in the shadow of betrayal, even against enemies who wielded power like knives. And as Richard's arm tightened around her in his sleep, Nancy whispered into the quiet, "They'll never break us. Not now. Not ever." The promise hung in the dark, fragile, yet unyielding blood and shadow, love and fire. The city was restless, its pulse quickened by whispers of scandal. Every news outlet carried fragments of the war between Richard Williams and the Peyton dynasty. Evelyn's smirk replayed endlessly on television screens, her insinuations sharpened into daggers. To the outside world, Richard was cornered. But a plan was forged inside the penthouse, beneath the weight of silence and determination. Alan spread documents across the library table, his eyes tired but burning with resolve. "If we want to end this, we can't fight in shadows anymore. We take it to the light, evidence, names, dates, all of it. We hold an international press conference and expose Evelyn and Thomas for what they are." Richard stood by the window, the Manhattan skyline fractured in the glass. "Evidence is meaningless if no one believes it. That's why we give them more than evidence." Nancy said, her voice steady. She stepped closer, laying a hand on the table. "We provide them with a story they can't ignore. Evelyn's obsession, Thomas's betrayal, the fire, the forged documents. Every move they've made, it's not just crime. It's obsession turned into cruelty. People understand obsession. They'll see the truth. Richard turned, meeting her gaze. For a moment, the Ice King softened his jaw, unclenching the weight in his eyes, shifting. "And if they don't?" "Then we fight anyway," she whispered. "Because silence is what they want, and I won't live in silence again." Alan nodded. "The press conference is set for Friday. Midtown Conference Center. We'll stream it live across every network. Once it's out, they can't bury it." Richard's gaze drifted back to the city, his reflection pale against the night. Then on Friday, the board, the city, and the world will finally see the truth. The morning of the press conference was steel gray with the sky low and clouds threatening rain. Richard dressed in his charcoal suit, which had carried him through negotiations that shaped markets. But the stakes weren't contracts or mergers. This time, it was survival. Nancy stood beside him as he tied his cufflinks, her hand brushing his sleeve. "Whatever happens today," she said softly, "we walk out together." He kissed her forehead, lingering longer than he meant to. "Together," he promised. Alan's convoy of black sedans waited outside the tower. Security was tighter than ever. Every car checked, every street monitored. But Richard knew Evelyn's reach, and knew this day would not end without blood. The Midtown Conference Center was already swarming when they arrived. Reporters crowded the barricades, cameras flashing like gunfire. Protesters and supporters clashed on the sidewalks, their chants a cacophony of judgment and defense. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. The stage was set with a simple podium, microphones, bristling, and lights harsh and unrelenting. Alan moved like a general briefing Richard and Nancy in quick, clipped tones. "We'll start with the documents. Richard, you'll present the evidence. Then, Nancy, your voice will carry the emotional weight. The world needs to hear from you both." Nancy nodded, her hand steady in Richard's. But beneath the careful choreography, shadows moved. Marcus Cain watched from the periphery, his posture deceptively casual, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had reappeared 2 nights earlier, not with threats, but with an offer protection. "Why should I trust you now?" Richard had asked him then. Cain's reply was simple. "I know Evelyn better than you think, and even men like me get tired of being someone else's weapon." Now, in the chaos of the conference, Richard felt Cain's presence like a silent anchor. Dangerous, yes, but this time danger on their side. The conference began. Richard stepped to the podium, his voice carrying through the cavernous hall. He laid out the evidence, the forged contracts, the financial transfers, the fire staged as sabotage. He named Evelyn Peyton, her father, and Thomas Graham. The room buzzed with disbelief and shock. Reporters shouted questions, cameras zoomed, and the world watched through screens and headlines. Then Nancy stepped forward. Her voice was steady, clear. She told the story not as a strategist, but as a woman. She spoke of the shadows that had followed her, the threats, the lies. She spoke of Evelyn's obsession of love, twisted into cruelty. And finally, she said of Richard, not as the Ice King, but as a scarred and haunted man who had chosen to love again, despite it all. The room quieted the chaos, dimming into a hush as her words carried. For the first time, Richard saw in the faces before them not just doubt, but recognition. And that was when the first shot rang out. Panic erupted. Screams tore through the hall, reporters ducking as the sound ricocheted off glass and steel. Security swarmed, their radios alive with static. Richard pulled Nancy down behind the podium, his body shielding hers. Alan shouted orders, his hand already at his earpiece. From the corner of his eye, Richard saw Cain move. Smooth, precise, a predator unleashed. He spotted the glint of a rifle high above the crowd, one of Peyton's men hidden in the scaffolding. Without hesitation, Cain sprinted, The second shot cracked closer this time. Cain leapt, tackling the gunmen, just as the barrel swung toward Richard and Nancy. The struggle was brutal, fast, a flash of steel, a grunt, and fists against metal. Then the final shot. Cain staggered, his body jerking as the bullet found him. But his grip didn't falter. With one last surge of strength, he wrenched the rifle aside, sending it clattering to the ground. The gunman fled, swallowed by the chaos, but the threat was ended. Cain collapsed against the scaffolding, blood blooming across his chest. Richard was at his side in moments, Nancy close behind. "You fool," Richard muttered, pressing his hand against the wound. "You didn't have to." Cain's mouth curved into a faint, pained smile. "Maybe I did. You're not the only one tired of living in shadows." His gaze flicked to Nancy, softer now. "Keep him human. Don't let him turn back to ice." Then his breath stilled. For a long moment, the world seemed to pause. The conference broke into chaos, but Alan and the security team moved quickly, steering Richard and Nancy out through a side corridor. Sirens wailed outside, police flooding the scene, reporters spinning the story into headlines. Richard's hands were streaked with Cain's blood, his suit torn, his chest heavy. He barely felt the grip of Alan's hand guiding him, or the shouts echoing from behind. Richard finally spoke when they were back in the convoy, the city flashing past in streaks of gray and red. "The price," he whispered, staring at his bloodied hands. "The cost of power, of love. It's always blood, always a loss." Nancy turned to him, her hand covering his. Her eyes were wet, but unwavering. "No, it's not just blood. It's a choice. Cain chose to stand with you. I decided to stay by you, and you decided to love me. That's what they can't destroy." Her words cut through the fog, anchoring him. He looked at her, really looked at her, the woman who had walked through fire, lies, and shadows, and stood beside him. And in that moment, Richard understood Evelyn and Thomas had underestimated them. They thought love was weakness, but love was the weapon sharp enough to cut through the darkest war. By the time the convoy reached the penthouse, the city was already alive with headlines. Press conference. Erupts in gunfire, Williams. Names: Evelyn Payton. Thomas Graham in plot. Betrayal at the top, lawyer. Turned enemy. Mercenary. Turned martyr. The board would scramble, investors would rage. Evelyn would sharpen her next strike. But for Richard and Nancy, the path was clear. The final battle had begun. And this time, they would not fight to survive. They would fight to win. The storm had broken. For weeks, Richard and Nancy had fought in shadows. Fires, betrayals, whispers, sharpened into weapons. But on the morning the truth finally came to light, the city awoke to a different sound. Not rumors, not scandals, but facts broadcast across every network, spilling into headlines that could no longer be denied. Alan's team had released the complete dossier: Thomas Graham's financial collusion with Evelyn Payton, the offshore accounts, the staged fire, the gunmen. Documents, recordings, testimonies, everything. Thomas, once believed was his shield, became the noose tightening around him. By midday, federal agents entered his sleek law office on Madison Avenue. The cameras caught it all, pale but defiant. Thomas was led away in cuffs, while the city roared in shock. His mask had shattered. The man who had once been Richard's counsel and confidant was now branded as a traitor. And Evelyn, beautiful, venomous Evelyn, faced her own ruin. The markets she had manipulated recoiled, her allies abandoned her, and her father's name was dragged down in the undertow. Senator Payton withdrew from public life, his empire bleeding influence. By nightfall, Evelyn's face was no longer that of Manhattan's darling, but its cautionary tale. The Ice King had survived, and the world finally knew at what cost. The Williams Tower stood tall against the skyline that evening, its windows washed in gold by the setting sun. It was the same building where Richard had once stood alone, staring down at the city with nothing but ice in his chest. But tonight it was different. Nancy walked beside him through the top floor. The penthouse bathed in a warmth it had never known. Margaret was there too, her posture still regal, but her eyes softer than Nancy had ever seen them. She had come without an invitation, stepping into the space, as though ready to fight, but this time, not against Nancy. Mother, Richard said, his voice cautious. Margaret's gaze moved between them. For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then she spoke, her voice steadier than her son had expected. She said, "I have spent a lifetime protecting this family by building walls. I thought if I kept everything cold, nothing could break. But watching what you two have endured, I see now that walls do not protect, they only imprison." She looked at Nancy, and her chin lifted with pride, but her words carried something fragile. "You have given my son what I never could, not power, not legacy, but life. I was wrong about you, and for that I ask your forgiveness." Nancy felt her chest tighten, tears pricking her eyes. She stepped forward, not with victory, but with grace. "There's nothing to forgive. We've all fought in our own ways." For the first time, Margaret smiled, a small, tremulous thing, but real. Richard exhaled, the weight of years loosening from his shoulders. At last the Ice Queen had thawed. Later that night, Richard led Nancy to the heart of his fortress, the vast glass expanse of the 92nd floor. The city spread below them, glittering like a constellation come to earth. "This place used to be my prison," he said quietly. "I built it high enough to look down on everything, but it kept me apart. Alone. Empty." He turned, his gaze locking with hers, "Until you." Nancy's breath caught as Richard dropped to one knee. He drew a ring from his pocket, luminous yet straightforward, a band that seemed to hold the city's light. His voice trembled, but his eyes were unyielding. "Nancy Martin, you walked into my silence and filled it with life. You shattered my walls even when I tried to rebuild them. You gave me hope I thought I'd buried with the past. And now you've given me the greatest gift, a future I never believed I could have." He held out the ring, his heart in his hands. "Marry me. Not because I am Richard Williams, the man they call the Ice King, but because with you, I am simply a man who has found his way back to love." Nancy's tears spilled freely, now her hands trembling as she pressed them to her lips. She sank to him, her forehead resting against his. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking 1,000 times. The ring slid onto her finger, shining against her skin. Richard drew her into his arms, their kiss sealing a promise forged not in boardrooms or contracts, but in fire, blood, and rebirth. Years passed. The world moved on, scandals fading into history. The Paytons' name dwindled into irrelevance. Thomas's trial, a grim reminder of ambition twisted into treachery. The Williams empire, once scarred, rose stronger, its power tempered not just by wealth, but by resilience. However, for Richard and Nancy, the true empire was built not in glass towers, but in the warmth of family. On a spring morning, the penthouse windows opened to light spilling across the 92nd floor. Richard stood by the glass, his reflection softened. Now his arms cradling 2 small bundles, twins, their breaths gentle, their fists curled around nothing and everything at once. Nancy stood beside him, her hand on his arm, her smile radiant in the morning glow. Margaret sat in the background, her posture proud, but her eyes damp as she watched her son, no longer the Ice King, but a father, a husband, a man reborn. The city stretched beyond them, alive and endless. But for Richard, it was no longer something to conquer. It was something to share. As the sun rose higher, spilling gold across the tower, it erased the shadows that had haunted him for 16 years. The ghosts of Hannah, the betrayals of Thomas, the obsessions of Evelyn, all of it dissolved in the light. And in their place, Richard held the future in his arms. Thank you if you've walked with Richard and Nancy through this journey's fire, betrayal, and heartbeat. This story has always been more than glass towers and whispered wars. It's about love's ability to thaw ice, outlast envy, and turn even the darkest nights into dawn. If their resilience has stirred something in you, share this story. Leave your voice in the comments. Let others know that hope isn't naive. It's the bravest choice we can make. Because sometimes the greatest empire we can ever build is not in wealth or power, but in the arms we choose to call home.